when crocodiles became whales. You are probably already thinking, is this guy serious? Well, stick with me and I shall explain. Whale evolution is today considered a scientific fact and the best example of evolution. But how factual and reliable is it? Let's start by looking at this creature here, a creature which scientists have decided to call Rodhocetus casrani. When the remains of this creature were found, they caused quite a stir in the evolutionist community, especially as the paleontologist who discovered the remains, Phil Gingerich, gave it a tail fluke and flippers, even though these were not found with the remains. He simply allowed his imagination to run wild and added these features in order to create a missing link. Bear this in mind because I'm about to show you that this is not the only thing which Gingerich has taken liberties with. This find was enough to convince most evolutionists that they had found a highly significant intermediate fossil, providing irrefutable evidence that evolution had occurred. Gingerich and his team subsequently found the front legs and toes of the creature, so now the story had to change. Nevertheless, we still see the creature portrayed today with flippers for the hind feet in an attempt to prove that evolution is more than just a theory. So now we are expected to believe that the creature had two ordinary feet for its two front legs, but had flippers for its two hind feet. Again, evolutionists are allowing their imagination to run wild. With the exception of one of the femurs, I can find no evidence whatsoever that Gingerich has even found the hind legs. But it is about to get even more interesting. This is the skull of Rodhocetus casrani. Do you notice anything strange about this skull? What about this upper jaw? To my knowledge, the only creature to have a jaw like this is a crocodile. Now, it may initially appear that this creature has its nostril halfway along the top of its head, and this is what Gingerich is claiming to be proof that it is an intermediate species. This, however, is nothing more than an interpretation. Having made the claim that Rodhocetus is the remains of a crocodile, when we look at the anatomy of a crocodile, we see that it has this nasal passage running all along the top of its upper jaw. All that has happened in the case of Rodhocetus casrani is that this part of the snout has broken off. In fact, if we look at this picture here, we can see remains of that passage, shown here as a groove, running from where Gingerich is claiming the nostril is actually located, up to the end of its snout where its nostril will originally have been. What you are looking at here is the skull of Rodhocetus, which is on public display at the Nebraska State Museum of Natural History in Lincoln, Nebraska. Note that they are only displaying the upper jaw. The mirror below it shows what it looks like underneath. Notice how badly preserved the skull actually is. Notice also that it is being displayed without any teeth. In yet another museum exhibition, Rodhocetus casrani is displayed with a full set of teeth. This is in contrast to the few teeth which were shown on the original skull we looked at a moment ago. When you look at the plan showing the fine positions of the various parts of the skeleton, you will notice that the bones have been scattered all over the place. From this diagram you can see that they have only found a handful of teeth, so any reconstruction is tentative at best. Notice also the lower mandible, that is the lower jaw, has ended up in two separate pieces, which you can see here located well to the rear of the upper part of the skull. Notice that they are not even symmetrical, which means that they have also been badly damaged. We just do not know how damaged they actually are. Gingrich assumes that this animal is a precursor to a whale, so he reconstructs the back of the jaw based on that belief. He does so by comparing these bones with those of a cetacean. You will notice also that a crocodile has this hole at the back of the lower jaw known as a mandibular fenestra. This is one of the defining features of a crocodile. If, as I am demonstrating, these are the remains of a crocodile, then this is most probably the remains of a mandibular fenestra here. In my opinion, this part of the jaw cuts back too sharply to be anything else. In which case, this is how I think the rear part of the lower jaw should be reconstructed. But what do you think? Bear in mind that the mandibular fenestra can sometimes be quite small, as in this particular crocodile. You will notice also that the rear part of the jaw is quite high on Rodhocetus. There are a number of crocodiles I have looked at which do have a high jaw like this. Nevertheless, look at what Phil Gingrich has done here. Even ignoring the fact that he has omitted the mandibular fenestra in his reconstructed model, he has allowed his imagination to run wild both with the reconstruction of the back part of the lower mandible as well as with the reconstruction of this part of its head. He has deliberately reshaped it so that it looks like that of a cetacean. This is not science. This is interpretation of the evidence according to what Gingrich wants it to say. As I am beginning to demonstrate, these are the remains of a crocodile, not a walking whale as evolutionists are so keen to claim. Let's now look at the teeth. Are they the teeth of a crocodile? Crocodiles come in a wide variety of forms. There is quite a wide variation in their shape, size, and even in the shape of their teeth. And yes, I have even found a crocodile with the same triangular shaped teeth as Rodhocetus casrani. Pay particular attention also to the high part of the lower jaw on these two crocodiles, which is just like that which we find on Rodhocetus. But what about the rest of the skeletal remains? The body is not that of a crocodile, surely. Well, to answer that question, we first of all need to remove the parts of a skeleton which Gingrich has added and which do not belong. They were not found with the original remains. This next slide shows the parts which were found in the original dig. Notice that, with the exception of the femur at the rear, the legs are missing. Notice also that the scapula, a bone which is often referred to as a shoulder blade, is not present here, which means that it has subsequently been added by Gingrich. In fact, by his own admission, which appears in his paper Origin of Whales from Early Artiodactyls, the scapula has been taken from the remains of another animal, one which he has called Artiocetus. Of this creature they have a skull and one or two ankle bones in addition to this scapula. The ankle bones and the scapula are clearly of some sort of deer or cow. The head appears to be that of some sort of carnivorous animal. Bear in mind that carnivores will eat other land animals. I would suggest that Gingrich and his team have wrongly assigned the remains of one creature to the remains of another. Bear in mind that the suggestion by evolutionists that Rodhocetus had flippers for its hind legs is pure fantasy. In an interview, Gingrich mentions the parts that they did subsequently find, and he makes no mention of a scapula or the hind legs. To my knowledge, with the exception of the femur of the rear right leg of Rodhocetus which you see here, these have not been found. So let's hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rodhocetus, so we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rodhocetus.
Now, since then, we've found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arm, the arms, in other words, of Rodhocetus. And we understand that it doesn't have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale. And if you don't have flippers, I don't think you can have a fluke tail and really powered swimming. And so I now doubt that Rodhocetus would have had a fluke tail.
Okay, so when we look at the skeleton of Rodhocetus casrani, the hand and the front arm, all of the forelimbs have been found. We know that for certain. We have no evidence that the scapula has been found. As mentioned a moment ago, that seems to have been added by Gingrich, who has taken the bone from another animal. Note that this scapula does not belong to a crocodile. And to my knowledge, with the exception of the femur of the right leg, the hind legs have not been found either. But take a good look at the femur. It is unmistakably the femur of a crocodile. And you should also note that he has added a tail, even though we know that the tail has not been found. As you can appreciate, a crocodile's tail is much longer than this. Notice also that this tail makes the creature look even more like a crocodile. But they are already persuaded in their own minds that it is a walking whale, and so do not notice that they have the battered remains of a crocodile. What you are witnessing here is fabrication of the evidence to fit the interpretation. When you remove these parts which Gingrich has added, bone for bone, this creature is nothing more than a crocodile. The spines on its back suggest that it is more specifically a saltwater crocodile. Even when we look at the feet of Rodhocetus and compare them with those of a crocodile, we have a reasonably conclusive match. I have provided two different diagrams of a crocodile's feet to demonstrate that these can differ from animal to animal. Admittedly, the phalanges of Rodhocetus, that is the two long middle toe bones you see in the picture on the left, are a little bit longer than those of the ones in the diagrams I am showing you here. But this does not change the fact that these are unmistakably the feet of a crocodile. You will notice that Rodhocetus is missing one of its toes, but I would stress that paleontologists rarely find the full skeleton. Consider, for example, Lucy. From these few bone fragments they have imagined this. Subsequent research has shown that this Australopithecine ape they have decided to call Lucy was a knuckle walker, lived in trees and had the feet of an ape. The paleontologists have filled in the gaps and simply allowed their imagination to run wild in their portrayal of Lucy with a human-like appearance. And this is what is presented to us as science. In an article written by J. Michael Parrish entitled The Origin of Crocodilian Locomotion, which appeared in the autumn 1987 edition of Paleobiology, the author commented that he believed that crocodiles at one time walked with a more erect stance. Of course, this is his interpretation of the evidence, which interpretation can be taken with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, he found a crocodile with a very small fifth digit, as well as mediolateral overlapping of the metatarsus, meaning simply that the bones overlapped near the wrist, just as they do in Rodhocetus. We must therefore expect morphological differences in these animals. When we examine what is being presented to us as the walking whale which they have called Rodhocetus, we find that anatomically it is nothing more than a crocodile. In fact, Rodhocetus looks more like a crocodile than it does a whale. It is only a walking whale because these people want to believe that it is a walking whale. The only evolution which is going on here is what is occurring in the over-fertile imagination of these people who are desperate to prove that evolution has occurred. So they will continue to manipulate the evidence to support that belief. They want to believe that Rodhocetus casrani is an intermediate form, so they add flippers to its hind legs. Bear in mind that soft tissue rarely gets preserved in the fossil record. Unless the skin gets preserved with the fossil remains, it is impossible to ascertain whether or not feet like this were webbed. It would be pure speculation. It is impossible to tell from bare bones what any animal actually looked like. In a moment, I will show you how the same computer modelling techniques used to determine what these fossils looked like, when applied to the bones of known animals today, produce some weird results. So don't let them fool you with their contrived reconstructions, because these reconstructions are nothing more than fanciful interpretations. It should be stressed that crocodiles and alligators do have webbed feet, but they are not flippers and they are not anything like the webbed feet of ducks and geese. The webbing on crocodiles' feet is barely visible. If we consider this crocodile here, take a good look at his hind feet. Look at the length of them. Do I need to point out that crocodiles do not have flippers or webbed feet like those of a duck? Just because an animal has long feet or toes does not mean that they had flippers. Can you imagine a child saying to its mother, "Hey look Mum, there's a crocodile," and the mother responding with, "No dear, that's not a crocodile, it's a walking whale"? Can you imagine how messed up that child would become? And yet there are many evolutionists who believe that a crocodile with a broken off snout and a damaged cranium is a walking whale called Rodhocetus casrani. You would like to think that these people knew their subject, wouldn't you? Sadly, many of these paleontologists do not know what they are doing. They are simply interpreting their findings according to what they want the evidence to tell them. They can make up whatever stories they like until someone comes along and challenges them. And quite often that challenge comes from other evolutionists. Take for example this creature which is being promoted as Puigilla the walking seal, a beautiful transitional fossil, the National Geographic article boldly claims. The Canadian Museum of Nature describes it as Darwin's missing link in early seal evolution. In reality, it very closely resembles the skeletal remains of a North American otter. So why are they calling it a seal and claiming that it is an intermediate species? Richard Dawkins wrote, "Puigilla neatly straddles the gap between land and water in the ancestry of pinnipeds. It is yet another delightful addition to our growing list of links that are no longer missing." But it's an otter. What then does it say about the competency of these people who cannot recognise the remains of an otter when they see one, or, in Gingrich's case, the remains of a crocodile? We often get paleontologists making wild claims that they know what the original creature looked like from their remains, and they present their interpretations as though they were a scientific fact. A group of artists led by John Conway, who is described as a paleontological and fine artist, whose work has been used for National Geographic, Discovery Channel and the American Museum of Natural History, to name but a few of his achievements, decided to produce a book, All Yesterdays, described as providing unique and speculative views of dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals. This team of writers decided to use the same computer-generated reconstructions on modern animals. The results are very interesting. Take for example a cow. We would not know what colour hide a cow would have had, so we might be inclined to add a little colour. And then these swans on the right. It would not be obvious from the fossil remains that the wings were actually wings, so we could quite mistakenly believe that they had very weak arms. How about a bull elephant? Or a manatee? This should give you some idea of how much is speculation. So don't let anyone fool you into thinking that they know what something looked like, especially when they only have a tooth to work with, as occurred with Nebraska Man, where they imagined an intermediate species of human based on one tooth, a tooth that turned out to belong to a pig. Most of what is presented as evolution is nothing more than the product of the paleontologist's overactive imagination. You can make bare bones tell whatever story you want them to say. Take for example the coelacanth. The coelacanth is a good example of how paleontologists get things completely wrong. People seem to quickly forget the wild claims which were made about this fish, which was believed to have become extinct at the end of what evolutionists are calling the Cretaceous period, around 66 million years ago. But in December 1938, a live specimen was found off the east coast of South Africa. From their interpretation of the fossil evidence, paleontologists claimed that the coelacanth had the beginnings of two front legs, allowing it to walk on land. But we now know that these are stabilizer fins and are not even remotely like legs. They most certainly do not use these fins for walking around on the bottom of the ocean. This is yet another failed interpretation of the fossil evidence. They also claimed that a coelacanth had a primitive lung, allowing it to leave the water and walk on land. This primitive lung turned out to be nothing more than a lipid pouch. It did not have a lung of any description. Yet another failed interpretation of the fossil evidence. From the fossil evidence, paleontologists claimed that this fish lived in swamps. They actually live in the ocean depths, typically 100 to 120 feet below the surface, and when caught will die within a few hours due to it being removed from the pressurized environment of its natural habitat. So much for the idea that it lived in swamps. Remains of coelacanths have even been found in what paleontologists are calling the Triassic period throughout the western United States, including as far inland as Texas. If these fishes live in the depths of the sea, then what does it say about the formation of these Triassic and Cretaceous periods? We are not talking about slow gradual deposition here. Despite the fact that coelacanths today are found only in deep waters, evolutionists are still even now claiming that some coelacanths did at one time live in swamps. This, however, is their interpretation based on their secular worldview. It should be stressed that dinosaur remains have been found buried with ducks, birds, owls, bees, wasps and other land animals and insects, all of which have been buried with an assortment of fish, including the aforesaid coelacanth, sharks, sawfish, stingrays, as well as billions of clams and other marine creatures. The fossil record therefore shows the instant mixed burial of creatures of the land, sea and air, all interred together in the same catastrophic event. But you will find that evolutionist scientists are almost completely silent about these discoveries. They always try to avoid the obvious interpretation. Finding that dinosaur remains are consistently found in marine deposits, one evolutionist scientist wrote, "The late Cretaceous was a time of tremendous global change, as the final stages of the age of dinosaurs were shaped by climate and sea level fluctuations." Oh, they'll accept sea level fluctuations when it suits them, but not a worldwide flood. He continues, "In Western Europe, much of the Ibero-Armorican landmass emerged concurrent with the westward withdrawal of the seaways in the North Pyrenean and South Pyrenean areas." Note that the Pyrenees are a range of mountains separating France from Spain. Although these, that is the dinosaur remains, are isolated skeletal elements, referring to vertebrate remains, that washed out to sea, or so they assume, they are remarkably common and have been reported in surprisingly large numbers since the early discoveries. They are finding these dinosaur bones on land, but are claiming that they were washed out to sea. Would it not be more logical to assume that the sea creatures were washed onto the land, with the sea burying both land and marine creatures together? You will find that no evolutionist scientist wants to go there, because that would be too much like a major catastrophic event, something which they simply will not bring themselves to accept, because it would be too biblical in nature. As you can see from this chart, numerous bird skeletons have been found with dinosaurs in what they are calling the late Cretaceous period. One study records, however, within a short geological period by the early Cretaceous, a range of aquatic birds and shorebirds began to appear, making a transition to more modern forms. A few such fossils represent modern groups such as flamingos, loons, cormorants and sandpipers, although some, such as Hesperornis, still retained reptile-like teeth. This is despite the fact that, with the exception of a few which have gone extinct, these fossilised remains are exactly like their modern equivalents, with no evidence of any intermediate forms. Another group of evolutionists commented that all methods employed here agree that the basal divergences within Neornithes, that is modern birds, occurred in the Cretaceous, supporting the refutation of a Cenozoic origin, that is post-dinosaur era, of modern lineages. No matter what argument you put forward, evolutionist scientists will always avoid the obvious interpretations in favour of their atheistic worldview. I would emphasise again that you can make the fossil evidence say almost whatever you want it to say, and because this information comes from a scientist, people think it must be right. Let us now turn to another supposed intermediate species, Tiktaalik rosea, or Tiktaalik for short. This is a fossil discovered by Neil Shubin in 2004. What you are looking at here is a model which Shubin has made. And this is what they actually found. Neil Shubin has made some wild claims about this fossil, and everyone has simply repeated these interpretations verbatim. They are claiming that they have found legs at the rear of the fossil in the area which is marked with the red square in the picture on the top right of the screen. Remember that they made similar claims concerning the Coelacanth. Notice also how small the fin is, and in his recreated model, Shubin has even elongated the head of Tiktaalik to make it appear more lizard-like. In their reconstruction of this creature, the scientists have made a lot of assumptions about its anatomy. Notice in particular that they have greatly increased the size of its front fins, so that they can claim that they are in the process of turning into legs. This is pure imagination on their part. Do you recall how Dr. Phil Gingrich reshaped the back of Rodhocetus's head to make it appear to be a cetacean? Tiktaalik's fins, considering the size of its head, are unlikely to have been strong enough for the fish to have lifted its head as portrayed in this picture. Berkeley University wrote, "Tiktaalik is technically a fish, complete with scales and gills." So they admit that it is a fish. They go on to say, but it has the flattened head of a crocodile and unusual fins. Remember that the fins on the Tiktaalik fossil are small. They continue by telling us that its fins have thin ray bones for paddling like most fishes, but they also have sturdy interior bones that would have allowed Tiktaalik to prop itself up in shallow water and use its limbs for support as most four-legged animals do. But this statement is pure conjecture on their part. There is simply no evidence to show that the fins were long enough to allow the fish to prop itself up as they are claiming. Chicago University, in an article on medicine of all places, describes Tiktaalik as being a lobe-finned fish with a broad flat head and sharp teeth. Tiktaalik looked like a cross between a fish and a crocodile, growing up to a length of 9 feet as it hunted in shallow freshwater environments. It had gills, scales and fins, but also had tetrapod-like features such as a mobile neck, robust ribcage and primitive lungs. In particular, its large forefins had shoulders, elbows and partial wrists, which allowed it to support itself on ground. Most of the above description is nothing more than inference based on what the scientists want to hear. The suggestion that it had a mobile neck and shoulders is pushing their interpretations to the limit. You can quite clearly see from the fossil itself that it did not have a neck. Likewise, in the literature I have read, I can find no discussion on the finding of teeth on Tiktaalik. Nevertheless, Tiktaalik would not be the only fish which has teeth. Everyone knows that pike have teeth. A coelacanth also has teeth. As for Tiktaalik having a primitive lung, there is no evidence to show that it had a lung. It had gills, therefore it was no different from any other fish. Nevertheless, if we can recall, they claimed that the coelacanth had a primitive lung, and this turned out to be false. And then there is great play on the fact that Tiktaalik had these huge fins which it could use to support itself on land. They said the same about the coelacanth, and that assumption also was false. You will note that the pike also has huge fins. But a pike does not use them for walking, and there is absolutely no evidence that they are in the process of transitioning into any land creature. Commenting on Tiktaalik's fins, Ahlberg and Clack wrote, "Although these small distal bones bear some resemblance to tetrapod digits in terms of their function and range of movement, they are still very much components of a fin. There remains a large morphological gap between them and digits as seen in, for example, Acanthosterga. If the digits evolved from these distal bones, the process must have involved considerable developmental repatterning. So you see, Tiktaalik is nothing more than a fish. There is no evidence that Tiktaalik is in the process of transitioning to any other form. The same with the coelacanth, which has not changed one bit from the fossil specimens. We are simply looking at the products of the over-fertile imagination of these evolutionist scientists. I noticed that they are still even today claiming that these creatures, Tiktaalik and the coelacanth, are transitional forms. But this is just wishful thinking on their part. They are seeing what they want to see and making the evidence fit their expectations according to their secular worldview. They are calling this science, yet it is nothing more than invention. Yet they are quick to criticize, mock and ridicule anyone who believes in a God and Creator, accusing them of not believing in science. They are simply putting forward their wild interpretations as though they were quoting scientific fact. They don't have any concrete scientific evidence to support their claims. All they have are suppositions. Even genetics research is showing that Darwin's assumption of a tree of life where everything has evolved from one source is fundamentally wrong, and that there is no evidence from genetics to support such large morphological changes. We shall briefly touch on this point towards the end of this video, but I go into this topic in more detail in my video Dinosaur Heresy. As for Tiktaalik having a crocodile-like head with its eyes on top, it is worth comparing the Tiktaalik fossil with a dusky flathead fish, which is still extant today and can be found off the eastern coast of Australia. Because of its crocodile or lizard-like appearance, these dusky flatheads are better known to the Australians by the names flatty, croc or lizard. Now, I am not saying that Tiktaalik is a dusky flathead fish, but they clearly have many similar characteristics. For scientists to claim that Tiktaalik is evidence of an intermediate species, or even a transitional form based on the wild interpretations they are putting forward, is pure fantasy. It is also worth mentioning that in January 2010, which is almost 6 years after the first Tiktaalik fossil was found, scientists in Poland found tetrapod tracks which purportedly predate Tiktaalik, according to their methods of dating, by around 10 to 20 million years. These were fully formed lizard tracks. Of course, it can be shown that these long ages have been imposed on the rocks by evolutionist scientists in order to give credence to their theory of evolution, because they need their millions of years to support their paradigm. Otherwise, their theory totally collapses, and for them that is unthinkable. The dating of the rocks, however, would require a separate video in its own right, as it would take far too long to go into here. Hopefully, this demonstrates just how much of what these scientists tell us is inference. It is pure speculation on their part. Bear this in mind for the next part of this video. Having eliminated Rodhocetus casrani from their whale evolution progression, we shall now look at two more of their so-called walking whales. We shall start with this creature here, a creature they have decided to call Kutchicetus. Having demonstrated how these so-called scientists have fabricated large parts of Rodhocetus, it will probably come as no surprise to learn that they have done exactly the same with Kutchicetus. Have a look at what they have actually found. Notice that they don't even have the legs or the skull. All they have are a lot of small bone fragments. They really have allowed their imagination to run wild on this one. How can you possibly make anything out of that? It seems to me that they have the remains of a large lemur or a monkey, but we just don't know. They are claiming that it looked like this. Sorry, but this isn't science. It's nothing more than make-believe. It's making the evidence say what you want it to say. All of this information which I am presenting to you here completely destroys their whale evolution sequence, this supposedly being their best and most compelling proof of evolution. Let us now look at another of their animals making up their whale evolution progression, a creature which they have decided to call Ambulocetus, a name which simply means walking whale. As you can see, although they have a little more of the skeleton, they are still missing important parts. For this, they need to use a bit of imagination in order to reconstruct the animal. Again, look at how the various parts were distributed in the ground. The auditory bulla, this being the inner ear, was the deciding factor that Ambulocetus was a cetacean, that is, a whale or dolphin-type creature. This was based on the fact that the auditory bulla of Ambulocetus was very similar to that of another supposed walking whale called Pachycetus. The problem is that this idea that Pachycetus was a cetacean has since been discredited, as it has been shown that Pachycetus was a land-dwelling creature. In an interview, Hans Thewesen, who made this claim that Ambulocetus was a walking whale, based on this evidence that the auditory bulla was similar to that of Pachycetus, retracted this claim and agreed that the auditory bulla of Ambulocetus was no different from any other land animal. As this was the only reason for claiming that Ambulocetus was a cetacean, it is strange that it is still being classed as a walking whale.
What is unique about this skeleton that tells you that it's a whale as opposed to just a big land animal?
This is the tympanic of a bowhead whale. It's also called the bulla. Basically a bowl-shaped bone with a cavity in the middle. On one side of the bowl, the bone is very thick. That's called the involucrum. On the other side of the bone is very thin, and it's got this crest called the sigmoid process. That shape you find in all modern and fossil whales, including much smaller ones such as this modern dolphin, where you also see a very thick part to the tympanic. On one side, that's the involucrum, and on the thin side you see this crest, this wavy crest called the sigmoid process. So this is the tympanic of Ambulocetus. That's the whole bone. This one is somewhat crushed. Usually there's a cavity in the middle, and then the part on the inside is called the involucrum. On the outside, this ridge is the sigmoid process.
Now, is that sigmoid process unquestionable? Because I know that on Pachycetus there were some questions about that one. It was more like a plate or something. Is this one?
No, this one is as questionable.
So, in whales, the auditory bulla has a concave surface, hollowed out to assist in hearing underwater. The auditory bulla of Ambulocetus does not even come close to that of a whale. All modern whales have a distinct S-shaped three-dimensional finger-like sigmoid process. The sigmoid process of Ambulocetus looks nothing like the sigmoid process of a modern whale. In 2013, Dr. Thewesen retreated from his previous position. He now believes the sigmoid process of Ambulocetus is as questionable as the sigmoid process of Pachycetus, which other evolutionists have rejected as belonging to a cetacean.
Recently, some evolution scientists have backed off the assertion that Ambulocetus was an ancestor of modern whales because its eyes are high up on the head, like an alligator's eyes, quite dissimilar from whales and land mammals.
Ambulocetus may be on a slight sideline, and we think that mostly because it's very strange. It has its eyes raised up on top of its head in a very strange way, and it's unusually large for an early whale. But mostly the eyes up on the top of the head seems like an unusual specialization. Maybe it's not on the main line.
So, maybe it's not on the main line, he says. Does that even make sense? Either it is a precursor to a whale or dolphin, or it's not. They just make it up as they go along. Despite Gingrich's comments, most evolutionists even to this day represent Ambulocetus as being part of their main whale evolution sequence. Take this, Kutchicetus and Rodhocetus away, and they are left with practically nothing. The whole whale evolution theory completely falls apart. Notice how Gingrich stressed the high position of the eyes on the top of the head of Ambulocetus. Bear this in mind for the next stage of the argument. This is the reconstruction of Ambulocetus. This is the computer-generated reconstruction of that animal. Notice that the eye is in the wrong place. It is far too far forward in the head. Here is the original skeleton after reconstruction. Note that the snout is missing from the original fossil. Now, believe it or not, I recognised this animal the moment I saw it, and when I checked the size of the creature, it reinforced my convictions. Notice once again that even in this picture the eye is in the wrong place. This animal is the one portrayed in the Nilotic scene in the Dionysus mosaic at Sepphoris in northern Israel. Notice the high position on the head of its eyes. Remember what Phil Gingrich said about the position of the eyes? Bear in mind that soft tissue rarely gets preserved in the fossil record, so remains of the ears have not been found. Yes, Ambulocetus had long ears. Does this look like a walking whale to you? According to my research, this is the animal known to the classical Greek and Latin writers as a crocotta. And yes, I know that the hyena portrayed in the Palestrina mosaic is labelled as a crocotta, but there is good reason to believe that this is an error. But let's not detract from the main topic under consideration. I would, however, point out that the word crocotta means a small crocodile. And if I am right, then it means that this animal they are calling Ambulocetus was considered by the classical writers to be a type of crocodile. In fact, it looks more like a crocodile than a whale. This creature was certainly not even remotely a walking whale. The same animal appears on the brass frieze on the tomb of Bishop Richard Bell in the floor of the choir at Carlisle Cathedral in North England. You might not be able to see the ears that clearly in this picture, so I have drawn in the ears in this second picture so that you can envisage what they look like. Now, you may well be thinking that the toes of Ambulocetus are too long for it to be the animal portrayed in the Dionysus mosaic. So, for the record, this is the skeleton of a tiger. Notice the similarity between the feet of Ambulocetus and those of this tiger. And in case you need reminding as to what the feet of a tiger look like, here you are. So every part of Ambulocetus is therefore represented in this animal from the Dionysus mosaic in Sepphoris in northern Israel, dated to the 1st century before the Common Era. An animal which is also portrayed in Carlisle Cathedral and dating to the 16th century of the Common Era. How can this creature possibly be a walking whale or an intermediate species of anything? Today we would probably classify this animal as a type of dinosaur. Bear in mind, however, that the word dinosaur was invented in 1841 when it was first coined by Sir Richard Owen. Previous to that date, dinosaurs were known under the generic name of dragon. This will be explained in more detail in a separate video which I have entitled Dinosaur Heresy. When you remove these three creatures making up their whale evolution sequence, they are left with a massive big gap in their evolutionary sequence. They now have absolutely nothing. It is all one big delusion based on the fabrication of evidence. These so-called evolutionist scientists are seeing something which is not there.
The tale of whale evolution is a story about one of the most remarkable transitions in the history of mammals. The fossil record shows how these animals transformed from tiny four-legged plant eaters no bigger than house cats to the seafaring giants we know today. This change was dramatic and kind of fast. Fossils from over the past 50 million years have revealed whale-like animals of all shapes and sizes, each like a piece in the puzzle of whale evolution. Smack in the middle of this amazing transformation is Ambulocetus, a toothy predator the size of a sea lion and a striking example of a mammal order in transition. Ambulocetus lived about 48 million years ago in what is now northern India and Pakistan, and its full name, Ambulocetus natans, literally means the walking, swimming whale. But scientists will tell you that it wasn't really great at either. In the water, it was a powerful swimmer, but not very fast or efficient. On land, it was clumsy too, with legs that splayed out to the sides, a belly that almost dragged on the ground, and a snout that was so long and heavy it looked like it could barely lift its head. But Ambulocetus was perfectly equipped for its environment. It lived in partially freshwater environments like river deltas, where it lurked in the shallows and grabbed whatever prey that came near its giant snout.
With legs that splayed out to the sides, she says. On what evidence does she base such a wild claim? Even the computer-generated reconstructions of this animal show that it walked with upright legs. And I have even shown that the feet of Ambulocetus were very similar to those of a tiger. Note also that she confidently states that the animal lived about 48 million years ago. Yet we have representations of this creature dating to the 1st century before the Common Era and to the 16th century of the Common Era. They just make up a story and then present it as fact. This is what they are calling science. The truth is that you can make bare bones say whatever you want them to say. All you have to do is present the public with a convincing story. After all, who is going to question or challenge them? Especially as most people have been taught to believe that because it is coming from so-called scientists, it must be correct. Scientists must surely know what they are talking about. Sadly, especially when it comes to interpreting the fossil and geological evidence, they do not have a clue. It is all interpretation and guesswork. Another supposedly intermediate form of walking whale is the one they are calling Maiacetus. Look at how mangled this specimen is. This is the backbone of the creature. Parts of its backbone have ended up over here. The part of the skeleton which has caused so much of a stir is this baby, which has become embedded in the body of this animal which has been assumed to be the parent. Evolutionists are claiming that it is in the fetal position, but this is complete nonsense. The fetus would not be right up against the backbone. It would be sited at a much lower level. It is obvious looking at the baby that it is some sort of alligator. Whether the assumed parent is an alligator, however, is anybody's guess. If Junior here has been moved by ground movement to become lodged in the animal's backbone, there is no reason why it would not have been underneath the larger animal when they were buried, both clearly having been buried together in some catastrophic event. This is the spine here. As you can see, it has been pushed all the way up and over the creature's head. It is recognised that Maiacetus had a long tail, most of it having been pushed over to the right in this picture. It has already been noticed that Junior is actually facing the wrong way for a cetacean. Whales and dolphins give birth tail first, so evolutionists have to invent an excuse to explain this away. They can't, so they turn to a cow for inspiration and point out that the baby turns sideways in the womb. Note, however, that the baby is always facing the direction in which it intends to emerge. Their example is therefore highly contrived. They would have been better arguing for a breached birth. But then Gingrich assumes yet another wild connection by claiming that Maiacetus is an intermediate species between a cow and a dolphin. This is total insanity. They really have taken leave of their senses. They make this claim that Maiacetus is an intermediate species between a cow and a dolphin because of their interpretation of the remains of an artiodactyl which they have associated with the skull of some other creature.
But what's good about these particular fossil whale specimens is that they do show us intermediates in the evolution of whales. And we don't often get fossil intermediates, so we can actually trace the development of characters. Say, for example, the evolution of swimming in whales. We don't often have that opportunity.
They have a big exhibit on it in Michigan. I was just there. They have all these things just sitting out there. I mean, they're all there. I mean, you really have to be blind or 3 days dead not to see the transition among these. You have to not want to see it.
You have to be blind or 3 days dead not to see the transition between these animals, he says. What? Really? Bear in mind that Dr. Padian is here talking about the original whale evolution sequence before Phil Gingrich removed the tail fluke and flippers from Rodhocetus casrani. I am considering getting a degree in paleontology so that I can claim that a mouse evolved into a rat, which evolved into a guinea pig, which evolved into a rabbit, which evolved into a hare, which evolved into a goat, and which eventually evolved into a cow. All I have to do is put forward a believable narrative. It seems to me that there are many evolutionists out there who are so desperate to prove that evolution is true that they will believe absolutely anything.
They're all there. I mean, you really have to be blind or 3 days dead not to see the transition among these. You have to not want to see it.
As long ago as 1954, evolutionist George Wald knew that the evidence for evolution didn't exist. When it comes to the origin of life, there are only two possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved by Louis Pasteur 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion: that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. Notice that they choose to believe the impossible. In other words, they will argue to their last breath that evolution has occurred, no matter what the evidence shows. This bias is clouding their judgment. They will not accept anything that goes against their belief system, so they apply their bias to everything they see. Now, whether or not you believe in God is irrelevant. If the evidence clearly shows that evolution has not occurred, then you cannot say that evolution has occurred and then call that science. If the evidence clearly points towards creation, then we have to go with what the evidence says. The trouble is that this outcome is loathsome to evolutionists, so they will do everything in their power to resist such interpretation. And then we have Richard C. Lewontin, who not only admits that the fossil record does not support evolution, but stresses that they must not allow themselves to believe anything which might even suggest that there is evidence of creation by a god. He wrote, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. This shows their bias. Science is supposed to be an unbiased assessment of the data, but these people clearly do not want this to be the case. They will only accept interpretations that are based on material explanations, and that is not how science works. I would suggest to you that this is pseudoscience, and when evolutionists try to convince us that a crocodile with a broken off snout and damaged cranium is a walking whale, then they are straying about as far from science as one can possibly get.
Tyrannosaurs in the phylogeny of the branching history of theropod dinosaurs, they have a long missing record. And we're going to find that record one of these days.
Despite this rich fossil record, Darwin's predicted intermediates have not been found. There are no fossils showing a ground mammal similar to a mouse slowly changing into a flying mammal, a bat.
You would guess that there'd be some sort of a bat precursor, but once again, nothing. Bingo, they just show up. And so, as you might guess, that there are certain people that think they were specially created. They actually are kind of a problem with the creationists who like to, if things were created, here's a very highly complex mammal with all these adaptations, and bingo, they just show up at some particular moment in time fully formed as a bat. Obviously, we evolutionary biologists and paleontologists don't believe that, but at this point we don't have a good fossil ancestor for them.
But we have no evidence for this evolution. Also, the bats appear perfectly developed.
We don't have any non-flying bats, and so we can't pull something out of that, any kind of information out of that tells us how they might have evolved.
I know that everyone talks about the missing link for humans and whatnot. I believe that there are connections that are out there that we haven't found yet.
I'm going to trust what those experts did. Those experts came up with.
I have a strong trust in evolutionary ideas based on the evidence presented.
Can you think of any observable evidence for Darwinian evolution, a change of kinds?
I haven't seen it myself, but I believe what the textbooks tell me about it, so.
You've got faith in the experts?
I have faith in the experts, yeah. I guess similar to how religious people have faith that God actually exists, I have faith in the experts knowing what they're talking about.
The scientific method must be observable and repeatable. So could you give me one piece of observable evidence for Darwinian evolution?
Okay, I would point to, as one great example is look at the genetics of the stickleback.
What's that?
So stickleback fish are a very interesting collection of species that were recently isolated after the end of the Ice Age.
What did they become?
They're various species of sticklebacks.
They stayed as fish?
Well, of course.
Can you think of any observable evidence where there was a change of kinds?
Fish.
Human beings are still fish.
Human beings are fish?
Why, yes, of course they are.
It's not science unless you can question and falsify it. Unless you can say this is false, this is wrong, it's not science.
Scientists are just as much prone to holding on to old ideas as anyone else. Many of them are very conservative.
But there's always a chance with new evidence that we may find that there's a fundamental error in our thinking. No scientist ever says never, and no good scientist ever says always.
It comes down to what you bring to the questions to begin with. If you don't want to see things, you're not going to see them. And we're all guilty of not wanting to see certain things.
Darwin believed that all life evolved from one original simple life form, and you will often see the tree of life portrayed as branching off from this one source. The fossil record, however, does not support this belief. Evolutionist scientists have not found a single intermediate form. Genetics research also shows that this assumption is false and is demonstrating that every species is peculiar to their own kind. But there are a lot of evolutionists who cannot cope with this realization and resort to manipulation of the data to justify their claims. In the January 2009 edition of New Scientist, geneticist Graham Lawton made the bold claim that Darwin was wrong. Quoting from his paper, For a long time the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life, says Eric Baptiste, an evolutionary biologist at the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris, France. A few years ago it looked as though the Grail was within reach. But today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. Many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality, says Baptiste. That bombshell has even persuaded some that our fundamental view of biology needs to change.